For the final lab of the semester, we'll be looking at nuclear decay. Now for this lab, I did not actually bring home with me the radioactive materials needed for this lab, so instead we'll be doing simulations of the decay processes. Since radioactive decay is a random process, it lends itself fairly well to simulation. So here we're looking at a side-by-side comparison of the laboratory instructions and the Jupyter notebook that we will be using to perform the simulations. So for Phase 1, Part 1, we'll be looking at determining the half-life of indium-116. So the way this would work in the lab is that I would bring indium-116 foils that you would monitor with a Geiger counter. The indium foils are mostly comprised of indium-115, but we place them in next to a radioactive source that bombards them with neutrons, and when the indium-115 absorbs a neutron, it becomes indium-116. And indium-116 decays with a half-life of approximately 54 minutes. So you can see that the decay process is that indium-116 emits an electron, which is also called a beta particle, and then that produces a tin-116 nucleus, which is excited. Then the tin-116 nucleus becomes de-excited by emitting a couple of gamma-ray photons. And all of these emission particles can be detected by the Geiger counter. So you'll notice that I have some of the instructions here in blue. The blue instructions are the ones that pertain to doing the lab in real life, doing the lab in the lab. So we won't be following these instructions, but I put them there, kept them there for reference. On the other hand, there will be also some green instructions, and these are the new instructions that you will actually be following. So for this part, we're going to be, instead of measuring the decay products from indium-116, we're going to be simulating the decay of indium-116, and we'll be performing the simulations with this Jupyter notebook. So you'll notice in this first cell, we are generating Geiger count data. And so this Geiger count data is going to be produced with this function called Geiger counts. And the function has some inputs. We need to tell it the original number of atoms that we have, the half-life of our sample, the sample rate, what's the length of time that we want the Geiger counter to be collecting counts before it reports them to us, and then also duration. What's the total length of time that we want to take measurements for? So when we run this function, that will put the function into memory. So it's really important to first run this function so that it's in memory so that we can use it. So once the function has been run, we can go down to the cell which generates the data for indium-116. So here we're going to start with a large number of indium-116 atoms, and we need to tell it the half-life that it's simulating, which is 54.29 minutes, so we multiply by 60 to get seconds. And then we have a sample rate of 30. That means that we want to simulate a Geiger counter waiting for 30 seconds, collecting the decay products, and then reporting to us a number. And then it collects data for another 30 seconds, reports to us a number, and so on and so forth. We want to take data for 1 hour or 3,600 seconds. And then we will generate the data using our Geiger counts function and store that information in the indium data variable. Now, this is going to return, the Geiger counts function returns an array. The first column in the array is time, and the second column is the number of counts that happen during each time interval. Then the last thing that this cell does is that it saves this indium data to a CSV, or a comma-separated values file. This comma-separated values file can be opened by Excel, so you can do the rest of the analysis in Excel if you would like. Of course, you can also perform the rest of the analysis in the Jupyter notebook if you would prefer. So we will run this cell, And now the data has been generated, and this file that you can open in Excel has also been generated. The way that you find it, if you are running things in Collaboratory, is that you go up to this file icon and click on it, and then you see here is the data file that we generated. So you can do a right click and then download that file. And once you download the file, as I mentioned before, you can open it in Excel. You will see two columns of data. The first column is time, the second column is the number of counts. So when you open the file in Excel, it's a comma-separated values file. If you start doing plots and things, you'll want to save that file as an Excel file, because a comma-separated values file is very simple and can't store more complex things like graphs and charts and things. So the rest of this notebook describes the sorts of analyses you should be doing with this data. So we're going to be doing two analyses. One is we'll be looking at just the first few minutes of data, because if we're looking at just the first few minutes, the time will be small, and so we can expand this exponential using a Taylor expansion, and then fit the data to a linear graph in order to figure out what the decay rate is, and therefore what the half-life is. Then the other analysis we'll be doing is to take the natural log of this expression on both sides, and when we do that, we see we also will get a function that's linear in time. So if we plot the natural log of the number of counts versus time, then the slope would be equal to minus lambda, minus the decay rate, and so from there we can find the half-life. So in the second part of the lab, phase 1, part 2, we're also going to simulate radioactive decay using, this time, dice. Now normally in the lab we would have each group have 100 dice and roll them, remove the ones, so all the dice that come up as ones get removed. Those are the ones that decayed, and then the remaining dice are rolled, the ones are removed, and so on and so forth. And so for each one of these rolls, you record the number of dice that remain after that roll. And so that is a fairly decent simulation of radioactive decay that you can do with dice. Now, I'm not assuming that everyone has 100 dice at home, so once again, this is something that would be fairly easy to simulate. So for phase 1, part 2, we will simulate using a new function called dice remain. And so this is simulating rolling dice, and will return after each roll the number of dice that are remaining. So we'll also want to run this cell to get that function into memory, and then run the cell below, which will simulate actually rolling 1,000 dice. So we can make a plot of the raw data, and it looks something like this. You can see the nice decaying exponential. Once again, this has generated a comma-separated values file, and also stored the information in a variable called ddata. So for both ddata and in our comma-separated values file, the first column will be the roll, starting with 0, and then the second column will be the number of dice that remain. And if we look at the file icon here, you can see that we have dice data that we are able to download as well. So for the analysis tasks here, once again, we're going to make a plot of the natural log of the dice that remain versus rolls, and the analysis will be similar to the one we did in phase 1, part 1. We're looking for the decay constant lambda, and then from lambda find the half-life and compare with the accepted value of 3.8 rolls. So now let's take a look at the phase 2 options. So the first phase 2 option is to determine the half-life of silver 108 and silver 110. So for this part, if we were doing this in the lab, I would bring out to you a silver foil which has both silver 108 and silver 110 radioactive isotopes in it. So we monitor the decay, and since one of these isotopes has a much longer half-life than the other, you'll see one of them dominate the first part of the data, so the first few seconds, and then the second one would dominate the rest of the data. So the one with the longer half-life would dominate the latter part of the data. The one with the shorter half-life dominates the initial part of the data. So this is one that can be simulated. So to simulate that, what you would do would be to use the Geiger count function, and you would have to run the Geiger count function twice because you have two different materials with two different half-lives. So you would generate data for each type of silver atom and then add the counts together. So then you would have data that includes the counts for each type of silver atom, and then do a curve fit for both the initial part of the data and the latter part of the data to extract those two different half-lives. So another phase 2 option is to simulate radioactive decay with coins, and this is one you actually can do at home without any simulation. So the way this works is that you have 100 coins. So first off, you'd have to obtain 100 coins, raid the piggy bank, hit up your friends and family for loose change. And if you don't have 100 coins, if you have less than 100 coins, this still works because let's say you have only 50 coins, well then you just flip them twice to make up 100 coin flips. Or if you have 20 coins, you flip them 5 times to make up 100 coin flips. You could also use checkers or Othello pieces, anything with two sides where you can distinguish one side from the other. So what you do is you flip these 100 coins or other objects and then remove all of the heads or all of the tails, and then count the ones remaining, and then take the ones that remain, flip those, remove all the heads, and so on and so forth. And then make graphs of how the number that remain decays away. So this can also be simulated since, after all, a coin is a dice with just two sides. So that could also be simulated with dice remain, although it's probably more fun to actually do this in real life. The third option for radioactive decays is one that we have real data for. So this is looking at how lead can shield gamma rays, and the number of counts is going to decrease with the thickness of the lead. So we have real data for this because I took data about a year ago for an advanced lab project, and you can see the timestamp is from 2019. And this uses slightly different equipment than we would have used, but gathers the same kind of data. So this is a picture of the apparatus that was used. Here are the gamma ray samples, and the data that I obtained is here. So you can see that as the lead thickness increased, as I used more and more slabs of lead, that the number of counts, the number of gamma rays reaching the detector went down. And so you'll make plots of that data and show that it fits with this relationship. So those are the options and the types of things that we can do with this lab. Let me know, please, if you have any questions.